The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest gods, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy. And that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. I have spoke thus much to mitigate the justice of thy plea, which, if thou follow this strict course of Venice, must needs give sentence against the merchant there. What you just heard was Act 4, Scene 1 of The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare, in which the character Portia is pleading for mercy for the Jewish character of Shylock. You know, history is unbelievably tragic, and humans are unbelievably cruel to one another. If we read about our past, we'll find that modern conceptions of human rights, human dignity, and even human divinity have largely been an afterthought. And equality is a conception that was invented 5 minutes ago. We are riddled with slavery, genocide, and conquest. History is written primarily by the victors, and the losers, and often the victims, are forgotten. Now that is becoming less and less true because we are better at recording history, and technology makes it possible to make a better account of history. But nonetheless, it is still, in many ways, the case. And we have this problem because we can't fix what happened in the past. Now, I am genetically mostly Irish. And if you do a little bit of researching on the history of the Irish people, you'll find that they were a heavily oppressed people by the English and the English Empire, who, for many decades, many centuries, had the people of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and others as serfs in their kingdom. And it took a long time for those nations to have any sort of equality with the English. Now, the Irish, a lot of people don't realize, for the first 100 years of British colonialism to the Americas, there were more Irish indentured servants than there were African indentured servants. Many of them were even sent to South America and the Caribbean islands. And they were often treated as serfs or second-class citizens rather. And they were treated very poorly, not just because of their lineage, but because of their religion, the Irish were, vast majority were Catholic, while the English were Protestants, they're Anglicans. And there's a long history of sectarian violence between the Irish and the English over religion. And so when the Irish came to the Americas, they were heavily discriminated against, treated very poorly. They weren't allowed to own property. Many of them were barred from starting businesses. The Irish pub, the modern conception of the Irish pub, is actually taken from back in the day. The Irish weren't allowed in the regular establishments, and a lot of it was due to them being Catholic, or them. There's a stereotype that they were uneducated, and they were largely illiterate compared to the English. And there's also a stereotype that persists today that they were alcoholics. Now, I don't really want to sort of do a deep dive into the history of the Irish or anything. I just want to make the point that the history of the Irish is rather tragic. Everything from the potato famine to the Black Plague to the Spanish flu, the Irish were hit particularly hard. I could go even further with the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. They are the largest ethnicity in Eastern Europe. They were conquered and occupied by more empires than I could count, the least of which being the Roman Empire. And this is where we get the word slave. The Latin root of the word slave is from the Slavic people. So the word Slav became interchangeable with slave. Okay? Just so that people kind of get a perspective on scale. So, like I said, history is tragic. And then we go into the colonial history of Africa and India and parts of Asia, the slave trade, and all those kinds of things. And much of that tragic history is used as a bludgeon to frame certain discussions today. And one of those discussions is around race and police brutality. Now, over the last number of months, many U.S. cities have been burning with riots, protests, looting, wanton violence at times, all in the name of fighting quote-unquote historic and systemic racism. Now, I don't really necessarily like to talk about this topic, as I find it's generally very toxic. People get far too emotional about it and they cannot talk about it rationally. And it tends to degrade to a level that is to a level of conversation that is no longer worth having. It is definitely, anytime I've engaged in this conversation, accusations start pretty quickly. Mind reading is often, and there's no real way to have a conversation when the well is so poisoned with those manipulation tactics. And that conversation is the race conversation. Now, I have some serious skepticism about race as a concept. I think that it is largely a social construct, and I am sympathetic to the postmodernist argument about that. Though I'm not a postmodernist myself, I do think that you have to give the devil his due, and they make some interesting critiques. The particular melanin content of my skin should have no bearing on the facts, the data, and the logic. And anybody who would try to dispute that are engaging in a sort of repugnant racial essentialism that is unfortunately very difficult to decouple from our society. And what I mean by that is they're thinking on the exact same terms as white nationalists and white supremacists who create the idea of race and ethnic heritage to be primary and supreme. Your mode of being in society is determined by your pigment, and the perception in which you view the world is only and can only be colored by the particular melanin content of your skin. And that is a racist, repugnant view that people need to drop. Now, this view, it seems to me, skews left in modern society, on the political left, social and cultural left. And I'm sure there's many reasons for that. I think once upon a time it skewed to the right, but those days are over. It doesn't mean they may never come back again, but for the time being, it is mostly the left side of the aisle who sees everything in a prism of race, of pigment and skin tone, these sort of characteristics that nobody had a choice. And they use it as political cachet to push forward certain policy programs. And they engage in vociferous, vicious, and unabashed racism. I'll just say that. And many of our political leaders are doing it, but because they dress it in a veneer of equality and compassion, people are hoodwinked and bamboozled into believing something that isn't true. But if you look at the content of what they're actually saying and the policies that they are pursuing, it is these are, like I said, viciously racist, bigoted policies that no rational or compassionate person should engage in pursuing or promoting. Now, I realize I'm being, let's say, strong with my critique, but I think it needs to be said. It needs to be strong. It needs to be, we need to be forthcoming with what we're saying. There's no beating around the bush with this. There's no walking on eggshells. We need to tell the truth. Okay? And the truth is that racism is making a comeback, but it's not the variety, the old school variety of typical white nationalism. It is a new Marxist variety, left-wing species of racism that is no less dangerous and no less pernicious in its effects. And the reason I'm bringing it up is, like I said before, is the riots, the looting, and the protests that often descend into violence. In such cases as Portland right now, there's been, I don't know, it's been close to 100 consecutive nights of violence at the time of recording this, which is early October 2020. And I think it is clear that we can't avoid this conversation, especially for this podcast, because of the violence that is a part of these protests and that has been associated with these protests. Now, I want to say, I am in favor of a lot of police reforms. There's actually a lot of goals of groups like Black Lives Matter that I am sympathetic to. I think policing should be done differently in a lot of ways. I think not to get too much in the minutia, but I think a lot of policing they use deception. They use particular tactics that I don't find to be ethical, especially if it's the taxpayer who is forced to fund these security services, apparently for their own safety. Yet the services that they are funding are using deception tactics, like unmarked police cruisers and things like that. But there's far more than that, but that's just one example. Now, maybe there's a case that the police will want to make for that. It's neither here nor there. I'm just stating the case. There's a lot of cases to be made, sympathies to be had with police brutality. However, the problem is that the rhetoric has become so inflamed and so hyperbolic and so unbelievably detached from reality that you cannot have a conversation anymore. Now, in the wake of the George Floyd death, because that's what I'll call it, because I don't know that it was a killing based on all the evidence available to me. I'm not really sure what to think of it, but based on one event, it descended a nation and many nations. My country of Canada, in my own city, there was a protest of more than 10,000 people in very close quarters in the middle of a pandemic. And not only did our politicians not, after months of pointing guns at us and forcing us to stay in our homes and not run our businesses and so forth, they not only encouraged these protests, but they participated in them in many cases. So the hypocrisy is palpable. But that is neither here nor there. The protests themselves, the rhetoric around them have become entirely hyperbolic, detached from reality, and people have become incapable of having a conversation. Now, I will say that there are individuals who are more reasonable, that if you actually were to talk to them one-on-one, there's a lot more common ground than you'd think that you could find. And the majority of individuals don't want the violence, but they'll continue to associate themselves with movements that descend into violence, whether that's explicitly or not. And I think that if you are pro peaceful demonstration, you need to detach yourself and separate yourself from these. I don't even want to call them movements, these demonstrations, because they have become far too closely associated with violence. And that's at the risk of making a guilt by association fallacy. I know, obviously, just because a small group of people are violent doesn't mean that everyone is violent. But at the same time, there is some responsibility to calm the situation down until people can start behaving peacefully and stop hurting their neighbors, businesses, and properties and persons. And just one example of this sort of hyperbolic rhetoric: when the video of the killing of Jacob Blake was released, LeBron James made a statement saying something to the effect of, police are hunting black people in the streets. And I've heard this kind of rhetoric before, and it is really despicable and irresponsible of someone like LeBron James to say that, because that is absolutely not true. And I honestly, I don't care what his feelings are. His feelings are irrelevant. He's a multimillionaire. He's on the verge of becoming a billionaire. I really, he's one of the most privileged people in society. And I honestly just, I have no sympathies for LeBron James or his experience at this point. And his perspective is completely irrelevant, as he sits in a guarded, gated community with private security, from people with guns protecting his property and his family, while others are subject to the violence that people like LeBron James will apologize for. So that's just one case, but I mean, it's a dime a dozen, that opinion, and it's truly just despicable and scummy to say something like that. I can't stress that enough. So the things that are happening, and I've seen even good people like apologizing for this violence and defending these just violent thugs destroying innocent people's property and hurting them. And, I just want to appeal to people's conscience for defending this kind of stuff and not, and even participating in it and encouraging it. If you have any shred of decency, any compassion for your fellow man, any empathy for your neighbor, I just urge you to reject that type of thinking, that violence against peaceful people is not okay. Violence against innocent bystanders is not okay. There is no justification. Zero justification. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't, in certain communities, that there aren't legitimate gripes, that there aren't complaints that need to be addressed. And quite honestly, some of the results of these protests is many police unions in the U.S. are being defunded, or being challenged, which I think is actually, honestly, it's a really good thing. Police unions and unions in general tend to have way too much power that are given to them by the state, so they effectively become labor monopolies. And they, I think that there is some legitimacy in challenging these unions, and how they will oftentimes protect bad actors. So I have no issue with doing that, but when we respond in violence, particularly against innocent people, that's where I have a problem. You're not winning any favors with me, and I believe I speak for millions of people around the nations of the West who have experienced these protests and to some extent looting and rioting. Yeah, and a lot of this stems from sort of this conception of justice, right? And going back to what I was saying earlier about how history is really tragic, people want to sort of justify or bring to justice crimes of the past. And that could be crimes of 100 years ago or crimes of yesterday. And the problem with justice is that it is often depends who is talking about it. Depends on who you're talking to. They have a different conception of what justice is. There isn't an agreed upon conception of justice. And the whole idea of justice, I'm actually highly skeptical of. And that maybe is a whole nother conversation. But I do want to challenge people who want to pursue justice that history is tragic and will never be corrected. The only thing we can do is do better in the future, but we cannot. In many cases, the many people who committed atrocities will never come to justice. You know, Hitler's genocide, he killed himself. Was that justice? No, he escaped justice. And there's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing the Jews can do about it. There's no amount of money you can give to the Jewish people or land you can give to the Jewish people that would make what happened to them, that would balance those weights and measures. And often when people are talking about justice, what they're really talking about is revenge. And often justice is just a polite way to say vengeance. And a world that is run and fueled by vengeance is a world that is burning to the ground. It is not in our best interest to pursue revenge. It is not in our best interest to try and right every wrong of the past, because it will damage and scar your soul. It will make you an embittered, angry, resentful human being. And that's more than, just the people in your life. That is tragic for you. That's soul crushing for you. And so this idea of justice, I'm not saying do away with justice. I think there are certain concepts like restitution and reconciliation that perhaps can be something that are worthy goals and virtuous goals. But justice is most often just punishment dressed up in a sort of virtuous veneer. So I am skeptical of this idea of justice. And when all we want is justice, we will have no peace. And mirroring the common slogan I hear from Black Lives Matter supporters when they say no justice, no peace, I say back to them, all justice, no peace. And that is a guarantee. Now, I understand that's a brutal truth for people to accept, but it is a liberating one to embrace. That in this world, you will not see justice. You may, in some instances, in the rare occasion, you will see justice, but in the vast majority of instances, there will not be any justice. And when all we want, all we pursue, and all we advocate for is justice, it becomes eye for an eye, tit for tat, tooth for tooth, and nothing good. Nothing but wanton violence and destruction. And it becomes a mimetic crisis where when one person thinks they have justice, so they punish you, but the person being punished doesn't feel like it was fair. So they respond in kind. They copy you. They mimic you. And then the violence becomes escalated and elevated
to a point of uh, things like, all-out war, genocides, that sort of thing. So the whole conversation around race is obviously toxic. I'm willing to talk about it more, but I more want to talk about it when it pertains to violence. And I think that many people who are engaging in a more modern leftist version of racism should do some introspection, do some meditation, and really examine your beliefs and question them and question those bigoted attitudes. And I would say the exact same thing to any white nationalist or separatist. So, yeah. And my final thought I want to say, I started off this episode with just the beautiful passage in The Merchant of Venice, the quality of mercy. And it's actually in regards to a character pleading for the justice for another character, pleading for the mercy. And the character of Portia, she really talks about how mercy is superior to justice. And that the real brave thing, the real courageous thing to do is to give mercy, even when you believe that you've been wronged or your people have been wronged. It's to give mercy, to forgive, to let go, to not give people what they deserve. And that's a hard thing because much of our world operates in that paradigm. And I would say, as Portia said in The Merchant of Venice, the quality of mercy is not strained. Peace.